I knew that I wanted to work in film my whole life. And I thought that main titles was kind of a roundabout way to get into the film industry because I was always working as a graphic designer. I paid my way through undergraduate college as a graphic designer. And I was doing an internship in North Chelmsford, Massachusetts at the Wang Laboratories Corporate Communications Department. And everybody that worked there had either a master's degree from Yale or a master's degree from RISD. And we would have show and tell every week. And so somebody would bring in a Jan Tschichold book or some examples of graphic design that, we would talk about them as a design group. I was the intern, and one day a writer brought in a reel of main title sequences, and it had Altered States by our Greenberg associates on it. It had The Dead Zone on it. It had To Kill a Mockingbird by Stephen Frankfurt on it. It had Take a Walk on the Wild Side by Saul Bass, where the two cats fight. And I saw those things, and I said, man, that's a really interesting way to use my graphic design, but to get a better understanding of film production. So I knew in 1986, I was probably 24, 25. I knew I wanted to do that. No, in 1986 I was 22. I must have been 23 when I saw that. And from that point on, I knew I wanted to do that. And the funny thing is, there's a lot of people that are my friends that I've hired over the years, and now they have design companies, and now they're title designers. And I always look at them and say, well, I'm the one that I'm the one that wanted to do this first. You piggybacked onto my dream, but. Yeah, and so I saw those things. I thought, well, that's a great way of doing it. But then these guys at Wang Laboratories helped me get into Yale graduate school. So I wanted to go to Yale graduate school, and I wanted to stay there as long as possible. I loved being at Yale, and I was still pretty young. And Paul Rand said to me during our tutorials, I said, I want to work on film titles. And he's like, wow, there's nothing interesting happening in film titles. He was kind of a rival of Saul Bass, I think, based on things that he said to me in the course of our conversations. I felt like, he didn't admire necessarily the work of our Greenberg and maybe even the work of Saul Bass, because there's a lot of things that are typographically, you can find typographic sort of flaws in, at least from a modernist standpoint, in some of the main titles that are attributed to Saul Bass. So I didn't have Saul Bass as a mentor or as someone that I wanted to emulate. I was very inspired by Paul Rand's work, and so what's the point? I went to Yale. I wanted to study with him. I wanted to kind of sit at his feet. And he said, if you're interested in main titles, read Film Form and Film Sense by Sergei Eisenstein. Or if you're interested in film, he's like, I don't care about main titles, but if you're interested in film, read Film Form and Film Sense by Sergei Eisenstein. And I did. And I actually wrote my thesis at Yale, on sort of collateral stimuli when the work of the graphic designer complements the visual sense of the filmmaker. I was very interested in looking at filmmakers who had started as graphic designers or art directors at that time. Like, if you remember, Ridley Scott is kind of coming from a design background, and whether or not David Fincher was a graphic designer or not, nonetheless, I think he is a designer. I mean, I think the best filmmakers, of course, are graphic designers. And I remember the head of the graphic design program at Yale, Alvin Eisenman, said to me, once, Kyle, the world needs more graphic designers than filmmakers. And that came across as kind of a discouraging thing to say, but I know him. Well, he's not alive anymore, but I got to know him better, and I began to understand what the nature of that sort of admonition was to be a graphic designer. What he was really trying to say was to be a graphic designer so that you can be a better filmmaker. And I really believe that's true. I really believe that, the work of the graphic designer can complement the visual sense of the filmmaker or likewise. And you see that in where we are today, where everything is overlapping and everybody's doing everything and everybody, we didn't have animation. The graphic design was very separate from animation when I was in undergraduate school or graduate school. What's the point? So Paul Rand would talk to me about main titles, and I did, I made a storyboard and made some sequences, and he encouraged me to study Sergei Eisenstein. And in fact, I stayed at Yale a third year, and I got to do Alvin Eisenman gave me a Mohawk paper traveling fellowship to travel to the Eisenstein Cabinet in the then Soviet Union. And I learned a lot about the juxtaposition of images and editing, and not only that, not only sort of montage, sequentially, but even just finding contrast within a composition. Paul Rand was all about contrast. I'd show him things that I made, and he'd be like, "Well, that's not contrast. What the hell? What the hell am I looking at? Where's the contrast?" If you look at his work, there's always a strong contrast, dark and light and big and small contrast. And of course, what he was taking from Eisenstein was contrast within a composition. So if you look at the steps of Potemkin, you have the horizontal steps and the hard shadows, but then you have the woman's hair kind of when she's flowing over the steps. There's always, there's a conflict between elements in a composition in a film frame, and also a conflict when you juxtapose images. And so we're so used to now rapidly juxtaposing images that nobody expects that when you put two things together, you're trying to make a third thing like Eisenstein did. If Eisenstein, because they have no sound, he would take a guy's face and then double expose a jackal over that guy's face to communicate to you that he's a bit of a sneaky guy, or he'd put an owl over a guy's face to suggest that he's a wise guy. So he was using montage, combining two things to tell you a third thing. And we do that in posters all the time. We juxtapose two unrelated things to say a third thing. I was very interested in main titles when I went to graduate school. I got some encouragement. There was a teacher named Chris Pullman who was interested in motion, and he would talk to me about concepts, and he would talk to me about sequence, story, and sound. But many of the teachers were just interested in teaching us typography and giving us ruling pen exercises and, developing our visual sense. But I was trying to get more of an understanding of sequence, story, and sound. So when I graduated from Yale, the whole time I was there, I knew I wanted to do main titles. So I didn't want to move to Los Angeles. So I sought out our Greenberg associates. I sought out Richard and Robert Greenberg because I love the Dead Zone. I mean, I love, like I say, Altered States and Alien. And those guys are responsible for those. And at that time, we started using Macs for production kind of a year into my time. I started working at our Greenberg in 1988, and we did like the first commercial all on the Mac in New York. We started to get Macs when I was in graduate school at Yale. There was one day where all the students got a Mac on their desk, but we weren't doing a lot of digital production. I was still working with an optical printer, and we had two animation rooms. So we had a down shooter animation stand. So you had a stat camera, and you're making stats, and you're putting black tape on them and pegging them up, and doing moves on Codalus on artwork on a down shooter. So I got a really good, I thought, education into how film opticals work, how visual effects work, how animation works. We had Maya people at our Greenberg. We had a CG team, but I wasn't so interested in things that were not photorealistic. Like you guys can make photorealistic things now. Everybody can. But back then, we'd be doing things in CG, and it's just like, man, it took a long time to do digital thing. So I was trying to take pictures and start with photographing things. I mean, for the 7 titles, we photographed a lot of, hands, and we took the sketchbooks and we photographed it before the real shoot, just to sort of, what does it look like if you backlight the hand, or, hands with scissors, just trying to. And I tell young designers, or designers that I work with, what they end up, they go right to like Pinterest, or they go right to stock sites, and if they have an idea, which sometimes they don't, but if they have an idea, they try to, cobble together an execution of a narrative idea using found pictures and sort of color-corrected Photoshop frames. And it's like, why don't you just draw it first? And then why don't you, trying to get them to think that photography is an option? I mean, you're spending all this time finding someone else's photograph that's not really in the right angle, and you're like cutting things out and painting heads on other. Why don't you just like go take a picture of that? Go. And it's just, I don't know why people don't think in those terms, but I like to go out and photograph some things, and then sort of prepare for whatever the shoot is, and then actually shoot the thing. Anytime I've worked on a commercial and I've actually gone to the location, like before the commercial, which is it's probably obvious for most people, but like, you go there, you take your own camera, you set up all the shots, you think about it, you sort of meditate in the space where you're going to do your commercial or whatever it is, rather just show up and be like, Paul Rand saying design is design, so we don't have to necessarily, while it's good to be a specialist and do one thing perfectly and be a perfect colorist, as a creative director or a director, I think you need to be able to solve problems for many different distribution methods. And my shirt is, this is Spatial Land, and this is we have a software company, and we're developing software to allow designers and non-designers to create their own VR experiences. So we're providing tools to work creatively in a VR situation. And one of the things I like about, we've been talking about movies that are virtual movies and experiences, but there's a process to me where this idea of focusing intently on one task, for me, it doesn't matter if it's a creative task or an administrative task, but I feel like, in the Bible it talks about whatever your hand finds to do it with all your might. And I take that to mean that I should try to do my best and, do an honorable job on whatever it is that I'm focused on at the moment, even if it's something that on the surface might seem like a menial task. So how does that extend into design is design? If you ask me to work on the logo for Stand Up to Cancer, I don't look at that and say, well, that's less interesting than this live action commercial opportunity for Nike. I do the best that I can on the rebranding of whatever typographic job it is, whether it be simple or not. And I do the best that I can if I have to do a large shoot. I'm not somebody who cherry picks jobs and turns away things because they're not high enough profile. I feel like Piet Zwart can make pipe plumbing catalogs that are magnificent, timeless works of art. Russian constructivists can, it's like whatever your hand finds to do it with all your might. On this day, I happen to be designing a business card. Okay, I'm going to obsess about the kerning on the business card. And on this day, if I'm figuring out the accounting. I'm going to just try to, like, if I'm doing accounting things or administrative things also, or even reading legal documents, things that have nothing to do with design, I do it like a designer would do it. I organize it. I'll cut all the text out of all the different documents, and I'll put it all into one document, and I'll format it. So I'll start formatting the typography so that everybody else's messy correspondence, I get rid of everything that's extraneous and unnecessary, like a chains of emails. I get rid of all the addresses. I bring it into a program. I typeset it in a legible font. I make it flush left. I put it into sense breaks. And in that process of throwing away all the unnecessary language and graphics, I'm becoming familiar with what the problem is. Like, that's my way of reading, is to, I am doing design because I'm designing my numbers. I'm making the numbers in a way that I can look at them. I don't like to look at things that are hard, that are messy. I don't like to go to websites that are messy. I like to, organize things. So if we're doing spatial land software for designers, like what attracted me to VR, and it's nuts. People are going to listen to this and think I'm nuts, I guess, but I like putting the thing on so that nobody will talk to me. Period. If I'm in an edit room, people still come in. I'm trying to focus on the screen, and people still walk in and want to ask me things. But maybe they won't, or maybe they will. Maybe they'll tug you on the arm. But if I'm in the VR situation and I'm designing in the VR situation and I'm Tom Cruise, I have this software now where if I shoot live action, it's like I bring it into VR and I can go like this, and I can separate out the shots, so I can click on this. So this is take one. This is running. This is, and then I say, oh, I don't want that. So the whole the editorial process, instead of cutting and throwing things away in Premiere or whatever, Avid or Final Cut, on a flatbed, the process of throwing things away, putting things in the bin, I can go like this and move everything away, and then if I click on that one shot, I can go and have it all. Have all the still frames sort of taken out, so I can, and begin to put them together. And you talk about when I was younger, organizing things, throwing away things that are ugly, editing, making choices, design choices, to me it's about getting rid of things a lot of times. Like sometimes if you put 50 pictures in front of me and say, pick 10 good ones, it's almost impossible for me to start by picking 10 good ones. If you say, I have to start by throwing away the 40 bad ones. I can't just go in and go, well, that one's really good. I have to go bad, 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 bad. And so that process of cleaning everything and organizing everything and getting rid of all the takes that you don't like, that's a sort of meditative process for me. And it's also it allows me to sort of immerse myself in understanding whatever it is that I'm being obsessive about at that moment. I get rid of all the information that's unnecessary, visual information or, written information. And as a kid, that I couldn't control what was going on around me in my, I had some difficult things happen to me, growing up, and I, people would give me a hard time because I was an artist or I was creative. And everything, sometimes, even just the house being messy, even just, my parents were divorced when I was younger. My mother was working and doing other things, and I had two brothers, and the house would get kind of trashed. And the chaos in the house was very kind of oppressive to me. So I would just go somewhere and take the sharpest possible, my pencils would be razor. I would just keep sharpening them. And then I would just draw incredibly intricate, usually monsters and fanciful things, because I could control that. I could make it so that there wasn't anything I would want to change. I could finish. And I have to know going in that this drawing is going to take me 6 hours, and I didn't mind that when I was a kid. I would, because I would just slip into the drawing, and then all of a sudden I'm in control again. I'm controlling this thing, and I enjoyed that. There's mistakes in the things that I do, in the same way that if I erase something, if I'm drawing something, you see a ghost of the erased image. There's, you talk about Dawn of the Dead. Dawn of the Dead is a mess. That's a mess. But people would look at it and think, well, how can they use low-resolution footage like that? Well, the reason why I use low-resolution footage like that is because I was sort of exiled from my first company. I'm by myself. I only have an Avid. I can't finish at 2K on an Avid. I have a finite budget, and it is what it is. What I can do is control the cadence of the edit, and I can make sure I don't use anything ugly. But if the film if a piece of video I have to use happens to be low res, I can crush it, I can color correct it, I can make it look the best as I can. But at the end of the day, this is my, this is the best I could do at the time, and it's not just the best I could do because of the limitations of my own imagination. It's the best that I can do because this is the box that I've been given to work with. This is the situation that I find myself in, and I need to, I'm just going to make a tight edit, and it's going to have some accidents in it, and that's what it is, I feel like I can be pretty resourceful like that. When someone says, I said I wanted the type to bleed for Dawn of the Dead, and they said, well, that's a fluid dynamics thing. I was like, no, I don't want to, I'm just going to spray the type with acetone and shoot it. Shooting it is all, you don't need, you don't need a whole legion of artists to go take pictures, and you don't need a whole legion of artists to edit your pictures together or your film together. You can, I'm happy to work on complex 3D motion capture jobs, but then it becomes very, it just gets, there's a lot of activity around that. I inspire myself by completely immersing myself in research and the content that I'm working on. I like to really, if I'm given a book to read, I like to really study it. And then I study it, and then from the language of the book or the language of the script, it's the same. Here it is again. I cut out all the language and compartmentalize all the language that I want to look further at. And I get rid of everything, and then I look closer at the language that I have, and then that language conjures up imagery. And then I might look at artists historically, not just current motion designers. I try to look through the history of art, or just history, to try to find inspiration looking at films. But most of the time I don't research visual things. I don't. It's always born out of what the content is, and so the imagery that I look at and the things that I look at, you have to do things and try things to figure out what the language is, like I mentioned. But Chuck Close is an artist. You know his work, Chuck Close. He wrote that inspiration is for amateurs, and went on to, what he was saying was that just do the work. He was saying that, so he was kind of wagging his finger at the people that go and look for inspiration and solutions rather than putting their head down and painting or sharpening the pencil and starting to draw. He doesn't do Pinterest of that. He, and I sometimes have people research imagery. I sometimes look at what other designers that work with me or for me, or other people within my company that are currently in my employ. I might engage them in a conversation about things. I might, solicit other people's opinions. I don't really want to know what's going on with my rival design companies. I feel like I have enough to occupy myself with my own company. I got enough problems in my own situation without worrying about what's going on with other people's things. Looking at other graphic designers' work, I pour myself into the problem itself and the definition of the problem. I remember I was nominated for an Emmy, and Imaginary Forces was nominated. My friend Michelle was nominated for one, and then our friends at Elastic were nominated for 3. And at the beginning, they had a lecture before the Emmys where the nominees sat in front of the audience, and there was a very full auditorium, and they asked us questions, and they had the moderators were asking us questions. But before that happened, they strung together all the sequences that were nominated and played them. And I remember thinking, they played Westworld, they played The Crown, they played Feud that I worked on, they played American Gods, and they played Stranger Things. The only one that I had ever watched from beginning to end was Feud, because I worked on it. Oh, I shouldn't say that. I watched American Gods because I pitched on American Gods, and I lost. And I actually did. I read the book, American Gods. I did the thing. I pulled out all the symbols. I thought about a bunch of things. But I still didn't win that pitch. But I really enjoyed the book, and so I was very interested to see, what won. And I was very impressed by the totem idea. I had the idea of a totem, but the way that it was executed, I wouldn't have thought of it in those terms. So I thought it was well done. But what's the point? I'm only saying all this to make the point that I had never seen the titles for Westworld. I saw like a snippet of the Da Vinci guy, but I don't really watch television, and I'm not trying to keep up with who did what and what other designer did what. Like I didn't, all the things, I wasn't pulling tear sheets from some other guy's music video when I was shooting the tabletop stuff for 7. That I was trying to watch the movie itself and read the script itself and say, well, yeah, it seems like he would cut God out of a dollar bill because he's making himself to be God. Like if and Paul Rand talks about, what makes somebody a good writer. What makes somebody a good writer is if you have something to say. If I have an idea and I really have something to say, I'm a good writer because I want to get it out. I want to put it down. So I study all the material and I try to see if I have something to say. I wake up at 5:30 in the morning, and I take my daughter to the bus because we live in Malibu and her school is about an hour away. So she gets picked up we have to leave at 6:10, and I drop her off at 6:30. Then I drive back to the house, and I get my son, and he has to be at school at 8, so I have to leave at 7:10 to drive him to school. Then I go back from Pacific Palisades to karate, as I take Kempo, Hawaiian Kempo, karate, and boxing 3 times a week at 8:30 in the morning. Then I go to work, and what I've been doing lately is finishing a bunch of title jobs and pitching on new jobs, and I probably do 33% administrative things and 30% administrative and 70% creative. I meet with the people that work there on whatever projects we happen to be working on, and I'm trying to pitch new projects. And I spent probably 15% developing content that I'm putting together presentations to with my agent to pitch on content that I want to direct. I have the rights to a few things, and I'm trying to produce some content. And I help my wife in the VR team wherever I can, because I'm very interested, like I say, in this spatial land software, more so for my own process, but also to help my wife. And I probably don't get home until 9:30 or 10. I think that somebody can be a title designer. At the Emmy thing I was talking about, they brought up the fact that there are no full-time title designers, that at any of these design companies, the title designers need to do other things. And that's how it was. That's how it's been. There's other jobs that aren't titles that you mix in to your title design. When you're asking me if it's a business, like if it's a viable industry, it's not the best business, but you can get by doing it. But most people supplement their title design work with other things. They do motion graphics for broadcast and commercials, and depends on the job mix is so varied, and we do so many different things at Prologue. It's completely it's impossible to we used to make pie charts that would say this percentage is advertising and this percentage is VR. I would say right now it's about, it's different for me too, because there's other people that do other things, and usually if we're doing a title, it's because somebody called me, so I have to attend to that. But we're doing a lot of VR things right now, so I about 50% VR and 50% everything else right now, this week, this month. But I have always had a title sequence. There's never been a time I can't even think of a 2-week stretch in the last 30 years where I haven't had a title sequence that's going on. It's like, so even if I have a break in the action, unless I'm all done, which I may very well be, I may be on the going, maybe someone's not going to call me, but I have a couple now, and I have a feeling something's going to happen there might be a time where I might take a break because I want to direct some of these other things. So it could be that I turn some things down if I do the other things. So for Memos for Hell, we made a little title sequence. It's the same thing. I think it's first you have to have a movie in VR, and then you need to have a title sequence in VR. But there's different considerations typographically in VR, just like there's different considerations for a website than there is for a main title. It's just like, but yeah, we'll do that. Nobody's come to us to do a main title sequence for a VR movie right now. We've done it ourselves, and people are coming to us more for experience, VR full-on experiences and not just type titles. I don't like the term motion graphics only because it's again, this design is design idea. It's labeling what we do. We make type move, and I think we're capable of a lot more than that. I wouldn't call it that. Somebody had a name for it. I spoke at another conference, and somebody had a different name that I kind of liked, but I forget what it is. But it was, just the idea of graphics. I think typography is somehow more noble to me sounding, not just more respectful to say that someone is a typographer. There's something kind of a passion implied for somebody that either draws letter forms or works. I have a lot of respect for someone like Jan Chikold that's, wants to refine the details of their craft. Motion graphics feels a bit crass to me. It reminds me of all of the kind of chaotic stuff flying around, but I'm sure we can think of something that's better than that. And how can you limit it to graphics? Because graphics, how can you not use footage, shot things? It's like, and how can 3D things be graphics? You say motion plus design, and I always thought of that as like motion plus. Like the name was motion plus, and then design was just kind of a tag at the end. But I was looking at the little box you gave me today. I was like, oh, motion plus design. Well, that's a good way of putting it. And then at least you're designing for motion, and so you could make the visual effects for Lord of the Rings. You're designing for motion, or you could do Clockwork Orange. You're designing for motion, but to be motion graphics, even just graphics, it's like, hey, where's the graphics guy? It's like, what do you work on a Chiron machine at the network? I don't know. It seems, when you say motion graphics, I think about like masturbatory decorative shapes flying around, not these amazing hardcore 3D sequences that we're seeing. Like, how can you call something like that? It's like, the movies that we watch are 90% motion graphics now, all the matte paintings and everything. There's nothing, whatever, Jungle Book. Like, what percentage of Jungle Book is a real, it's like a little kid running around a green screen stage with Jon Favreau for several months, but then is that motion graphics? I mean, it seems kind of, it doesn't seem a big enough word to cover all the things that we can do now. I feel like the 7 title sequence got the attention that it did because of the time that it happened in history. I felt like we were, we were just passing through the desktop publishing revolution, and we're starting to get into the desktop motion revolution, looking ahead to the desktop visual effects revolution. And like when Saul Bass did The Man with the Golden Arm, everybody said, hey, look at this opportunity where we have here's a situation with these main titles where we can do something creative. We this isn't just a throwaway thing. This is a situation where we can do something interesting, and it inspired people. And I feel like there were a lot of young desktop filmmakers and design students that saw that title sequence and said, yeah, this is something that I want to do. And I'm not just saying that. A million people have said it to me over and over again. And by the way, all the stars aligned in terms of who was working on it. I think me working, obviously David Fincher is a genius, and I have nothing, he's a fantastic director. He had me. I was helping him. We had Angus Wall. We were shooting, and Darius Kaji was the DP on the main movie, but Harris Savides was the DP on the title sequence, because Fincher it didn't want to. I guess there was some challenges with Darius Kaji, but the point is, Harris Savides, he died, but he's a brilliant cinematographer. And by the way, Jeff Cronenweth, who's a brilliant cinematographer and director himself, was Harris Savides' first AC. So I had two cameras. I have Harris Savides here and Jeff Cronenweth over there, and with two things going on at the same time. It was like this moment where everything kind of coalesced. And it's a bit embarrassing to be talking about something that is 30 years ago, but at the same time, it's not about me, really. It's about, like, we did this thing. We were, that's something where my youthful enthusiasm had a positive outcome, as opposed to the Newport South thing. Some of the naiveness about doing things and just shooting from the hip and just going for it, as it pertains to the 7 title sequence, worked. Whereas just kind of going for it and rushing into the Newport South thing, it didn't quite work for me. That kind of naiveness didn't pan out. But 7, it's been a real, it's wonderful that people responded to it to that degree. I liked these books. The killer in 7 had these obsessive journals, and I loved the obsessive writing. A production design, he had hired somebody to build these books because they were being used in the film itself. They were on the shelf in John Doe's house, and they had a few pages that were filled with obsessive, writing. But that's how I write. I mean, I write very manically and obsessively, and it's very interesting to me, the marks and the way that this guy was journaling his crimes. The thing that I found interesting about the character in 7 was that he took his work very seriously. It was as if he would. I have this idea of him, like, making a cup of tea and then, like, shaving his fingers off with okay, first thing up, take a razor blade and shave my fingernails off and figure out how I'm going to punish this person guilty of the 7. And I'm going to document everything. I'm going to take notes like an attorney, obsessive notes. And so, Fincher had this idea that there's Morgan Freeman is trying to retire, and he looks at a piece of wallpaper in a house in one of the earlier cuts, and he thought that maybe the titles could play on Morgan Freeman's train ride from his house in the country where he's trying to retire to back to the drive into the rainy, dark city, that it would be some kind of title sequence that had to do with the train. and they needed a temporary title sequence, so for a studio screening. So we made like a slideshow with some of the scanned elements from these journals. And then he said, the studio said, why don't you just use the slideshow and have that be the title sequence? And to David Fincher's credit, he said, we're not going to compromise on any level, and we're going to do something that's not just a slideshow. So he said, pretend you never met me and go away and think of something else. But I came back again, and I said, no, I think we should have a tabletop shoot of the books, because I was coming off of, I always wanted to be a director, you have to understand. So any opportunity that I could get at our Greenberg to shoot anything, it was like a big deal for me, because I would design a lot of things. People would pick my boards, and then they'd say to me, well, we're gonna need to bring in somebody else to shoot the live action. And that was something also that sort of offended me. It was as if I would design something and then they would give it to a more senior commercial director. So I would fight to get to shoot any kind of thing. And if I could just shoot a tabletop thing, it was more controllable, and everybody wasn't so worried about money as if I was going to go to a location. And then, so it was more containable. So I was doing all, anything from, North for Rob Reiner to like Curly Sue for John Hughes to Dead Presidents for the Hughes brothers to American President. I kept shooting all these tabletop things just so I could be on a set more and work with the DP and have that experience. So I make this board to show Fincher about shooting the killer and the book preparation and the objects and the props and all that. And they said, great, we're going to do this thing. And backing up a little bit, in the slideshow, I went and met with him, and he knew that he wanted the type to be handwritten. He wanted the credits to be as if the killer wrote them. But I was kind of thinking, because we're doing film opticals and everything, it wasn't digital yet, I was thinking the killer should, because he's a photographer, he has all these pictures also in his dark rooms in his apartment where he plans his murders, John Doe's character, and I thought it should be as if he made this optical, as if he made it in his bathtub, like the whole thing, not just the scratch type. But we decided on what the scratch type was going to look like, that the designations were going to be Helvetica all caps, and they're going to be overprinted, and the handwritten type was going to be, scratched out of I said we should scratch it out of a scratch board and then scan it back in. So we sort of had most of the credits already set for the temp title slideshow. And then I presented him this thing, and he started to talk about Mark Romanek shooting it. And I was like, hey, man, you got to let me shoot it. And he did, and I suspect Peter Frankfurt probably, talked him into it a bit. I don't know what happened, but and then he said, we need to also then shoot the type, and so we had this idea of, shooting codaliths with an old Arri 2C camera, and so we had this idea of shooting type with an old Arri, camera where we could open up the gate, and we could we put the codaliths of each credit on a on a light box and shook them and did all these accidental things, and then each credit, and this is what I mean about the kind of editorial, I became very obsessive about editorial, maybe from Eisenstein, or maybe just from that being the way that I could see the whole sequence. A lot of designers, they kind of make keyframes, and they know what it's going to, they establish a style, and fair enough, you need to know what it's going to look like. But I like to try to figure out how long it's going to be, and if there's a story, even though they're short stories, like what's the story going to be? Is there a beginning and a middle and an end? So I get sometimes impatient with still frames, even if it's completely drawn out. I'm not I don't feel like I see it yet sometimes unless I string it together. And I used to work on a flatbed, like a Steenbeck. We had moviolas, which is you can run film and has a little monitor, and you could take a China marker and you run footage through a moviola, and I could take my China marker and mark on the, on the leader of like where I wanted to have cuts and same thing on a Steenbeck. And so I was cutting film, you're cutting actual film. And so I like trying to see what the whole thing is going to look like.